Hey, everybody, we are going to talk about poverty one more time. And last time we talked about three philosophical positions on the issue of poverty and what government should do about it. We talked about utilitarianism, we talked about liberalism, and we talked about libertarianism. Three very different views on what a government's role should be from a philosophical perspective. And now what we want to do is get into some of the policy making. What are some specific policies that governments have tried to reduce the poverty rate or to close up the gaps in income inequality? And we're going to try to consider these from the topics that Mankiw lays out. And what we're going to really ask is, let's try to evaluate, are these things good, bad, or are they maybes? And really the question that we're asking is the Mankiw principle, the question based on the idea that government can at times produce better outcomes, right? Government can improve outcomes beyond just the market economy. Now, if you're a true libertarian, you're going to believe that that's mostly not true, except for just a few times. Like we said yesterday, if the laws are broken or if contracts are violated. If you are a utilitarian and you take that more middle of the road position, you're going to believe that it is a good idea some of the time. And if you're a liberal, you're going to believe in government intervention a lot of the time. So really what we're getting down to is, right, when we consider government policies, we're asking ourselves, is the government going to improve market outcomes through this intervention? And the answer may be yes, no, or maybe, right? Depends on how it's implemented, depends on, and of course, wouldn't that be true with every policy, that it depends on how it's implemented? And so I think we want to consider things in their more pure form. And so let's take a look at a couple of government policies that some people have thought can help to, remember what our topic is, either reduce or maybe in a utopian vision, eliminate poverty, and certainly to close the gap in income inequality. So how about this policy that we've talked about before? Minimum wage, right? A lot of people have believed that minimum wage is a great gap closer and that you can reduce poverty through the implementation of a minimum wage. So sometimes people who are saying yes to this, right? Yes, a minimum wage is a good, positive government policy for the reduction of poverty or the closing of the income gap. They would say, first of all, if you were to say, well, prove to me that minimum wage is a good thing. Well, the first thing they would argue is, well, how could anyone begrudge someone $9.75 or $10.01 or $11.50 or whatever the minimum wage is in that prevailing state? The very first question that would be asked by a person who was defending minimum wages, kind of incredulously, do you really want people to make less than this? And they would say possibly something like, well, if it wasn't for minimum wage, who knows how low wages would actually drop? I mean, what do you want people to make? $4 an hour, $3 an hour? And so the proponents of minimum wage would say, not only is minimum wage a good thing, but we need to continually crank the minimum wage up so that it can do its job. And what does a person who says yes to minimum wage as a policy tend to believe about minimum wage? Well, you'll often hear them say that minimum wage needs to be a living wage, right? What we need is for minimum wage to be a living wage. In other words, and if we were in class right now, which sadly we're not, but if we were in class right now, I would go to the board and I would start to ask, how can a person live on a very, very, very restricted budget? We might draw out a very cheap rent situation. We might add to the board a very little spent on clothes. We might add a very austere food budget to that list, gasoline, electricity, just the necessities, okay? And we would add that together on the board. And I would probably be picking someone in the room who I think is a skeptic of minimum wage or feels negatively about the minimum wage, and get that person to help me to construct a very basic budget, a very austere budget, a budget that does not have a lot of frills. And then at the end of the day, we would say, okay, well, let's imagine a person surviving on a minimum wage income. And we do the calculation, and you know what you would find? You would find that in most cases, the minimum wage is not a livable wage if what you're talking about is a person thriving and making a living on a minimum wage income. Minimum wage jobs, which are unskilled labor and entry level jobs, were never intended to support an individual, and they definitely were not meant to support a family. And so people who argue that the minimum wage needs to be a living wage are, of course, saying that we need to crank that wage higher. Remember the articles that we talked about where they asked, well, they asked these minimum wage advocates, where did you pick out the number 15 for $15 an hour? Why are you advocating for a $15 an hour wage? Where did you get that number? And they basically said, well, we thought that, 20 and 25 were too high. We thought 10 was too low. We picked something in the middle. It's a somewhat arbitrary idea, but I think part of that is because people who believe in the minimum wage do tend, everybody be calm, okay? Be calm just like we always have been. They do tend to be more from the liberal side of the economic argument. And so, to be honest, they're going to continue to seek to raise that wage even after they make the $15 an hour. Number one, because all other wages will climb and the price of goods will climb. But number two is because, remember, their ultimate goal is much more even wage equality, whereas the utilitarian just wants to close that gap a little bit. The liberal says, no, let's even things out. Okay, let's get these wages to a point where they're just more fairly spread. You guys probably don't remember this, but when President Obama was running for re-election, there was an incident where a plumber who later became kind of an infamous / famous 15 minutes of fame or whatever, Joe the plumber, approached President Obama in a campaign greeting line. And this was caught on tape where the plumber starts talking about that he does not like so much of the money that he has being taken away in taxes. He's become a successful plumber. He's running a successful business, and he's kind of complaining about the tax rate and saying how much he feels is taken from his employment, from his business as a plumber. And he's kind of calling out to President Obama about this. And President Obama's answers were, well, you had a time when you were training and learning, and you were young, and you didn't have a successful business yet. And now it's time for us to spread that wealth around. Became a famous point in the re-election campaign, that Obama felt that it was his job to spread that wealth around, and that Joe the plumber's wealth should be taken from his business, from his earnings, and spread around to other people. And it was this big controversy. Well, for those that take to the liberal side of economics, of course they believe that wealth should be more spread around, because that's the whole ultimate goal. Remember the Maximin criterion, right? To spread that wealth so that it's more fairly distributed. And so to liberals, they didn't understand what the big deal about Joe the plumber's the response to Joe the plumber by the president. And to libertarians, they were shocked and angered. And how dare we tell this person that their property is going to be spread around to others? So, minimum wage, right, for those who promote it, they believe that it can be made into a living wage by continuing to raise the wage, and they believe that it's more fair and equitable. People who support the minimum wage would make the argument that if it wasn't for a minimum wage, businesses would surely be running an exploitative type racket and making people work for just horrible, horrible wages that are exploitative and that are taking advantage of people. And so, for those who believe in minimum wage, those points are very clear. They're more than clear. For those who don't believe in minimum wage, and we're not going to talk about this for a long time because we've really already talked about Thomas Sowell's take on this. For those that don't believe in minimum wage, they believe that minimum wage is simply setting a price floor below which you cannot legally hire someone, right? First of all, they're saying if for people who say no, minimum wage is not a good thing, minimum wage is not acceptable. For those who say minimum wage is not a good thing, they are simply pointing out that by making this price floor and by saying you cannot drop below this price for labor, you are simply making it illegal to hire people along. Look at this. Isn't this convenient? You are simply making it convenient to hire someone below, okay, where the price would normally meet, right, at equilibrium. You're making it illegal at that equilibrium price, if it falls below your minimum wage, to hire them. And so you're just going to say, no, this is the new rate for hiring because the government declares it so, and it's minimum wage. And the people who are against minimum wage and say government can't improve an outcome in the market on this would say that A, government has no right to set minimum wages on businesses. They should be able to pay what they want. But they would also say that it creates a what? Right? It creates a surplus of labor because there are not enough employers that are going to want to go out there and hire these minimum wage workers at these levels. And so they will simply leave the jobs unfilled or hire fewer people and try to make them more efficient, do the work themselves, hire robots, go without the work, right? That's what minimum wage will do. It will cause unemployment. Sowell argues that minimum wage causes unemployment, and he also argues that minimum wage causes unemployment for the most vulnerable people in an economy, the people looking for entry level and unskilled labor, right? Because no one that's a Fortune 500 CEO with all these years of human capital and experience, and no one with this great signaling degree is primarily out there trying to get a minimum wage job. The minimum wage job seekers are entry level, seasonal, part time, and unskilled laborers. And the people who believe that the minimum wage is an improper response to the government would also say that there's a heck of a lot of minimum wage jobs today. In other words, a lot of jobs that are in that category of job that would not be in that category were there no minimum wage. So in other words, if we take 15 seniors that get a job and we ask, okay, what's your going rate? We're going to see that unless they work for nonprofits or, relatives or as waitresses, right? If you're just talking to people straight down the line in a regular old hourly wage, we're going to find that most of them are working for minimum wage. And we're going to find that the dots along the graph where they work are very, very tight, right? There's going to be a point at which all 15 dots are going to be gathered around that price. Is that because it's equilibrium price? Well, wait a minute. Equilibrium price is the price for a fisherman and the people willing to have him supply seafood. Equilibrium price is the price for a barber and people who want a haircut. Equilibrium price is not the price for all workers and where all workers and where all suppliers meet. There's so much variety in jobs, right? There's so much variety in the skill set, the particular area, how much businesses make. So when you think about minimum wage, it's painting with a very broad brush. It's saying that everybody, okay, in this wide category of jobs at this level, the magic number is X, right? Whatever minimum wage is right now. And so it just states it. It just says, well, this is just a good number. This is a target number that a government has picked out. It's an arbitrary number, and it's the number that we're going to say is right, true, just, better, fair, happier, okay? And I don't think that it has a lot of pragmatic and practical reality check to what equilibrium wage is. Now, you might be sitting there very frustrated, some of you, and say, oh my gosh, this lady is saying that people should make $3 an hour. Well, what a libertarian would say is that if wages were allowed to fluctuate without a price floor, it might be true that there would be a number of people not working, not making the current minimum wage. But two things would be true. Number one, they would be hired when under normal circumstances they might not find work. And number two, prices would not necessarily be where they are. Because we know the wage price spiral, right? And we understand that as wages creep up and people want to buy, prices respond. And so we can imagine that, and we've talked about this before. Do you really care what you make, or do you care about buying power? So what if you have a car that cost $120,000, okay, if all cars are $120,000? Because all that means is that your wages are compensating higher. There's been inflation. So we don't really care how much money we make. We care what is purchasable. We care about the buying power of our dollar. And so some people who would argue against minimum wage would say, certainly in the long run, prices are going to rise as more and more jobs fall into the category of minimum wage. It's not right anyway, and it's not pragmatic. So that's minimum wage. You have a yes and a no on it, and we're going to move on to another policy. Okay, guys, how about a yes, no, maybe, right? A discussion of another government policy or a government intervention that someone might suggest to close the income gap or reduce poverty, and that is welfare, right? Now, welfare is a catch-all phrase. What do we mean when we talk about welfare? Well, we mean various government transfer programs that take wealth from one sector of the society and in some way, shape, or form give it to another sector of the society. This can be through direct payments, or this can be through in-kind transfers that are not cash. So let's talk about a few of these. There is a program called TANF, TANF. Let's talk about that first. Now, in the old days, all right, you used to hear about people who got a welfare check, right? And you would say, oh, these people, they just get welfare checks and they live their whole life on welfare. Well, let's talk about that for a second. There used to be a program called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And what this said is that if a person was below the poverty line or met a certain portion of the poverty line, because some programs let you live a little bit above the poverty line and still get the aid. So Aid to Families with Dependent Children, how it functioned is it was specifically made for women who were heads of households. In other words, no husband in the home, no spouse in the home. And so therefore, these families where there was a female head of household and they had dependent children, everyone knew that this was difficult on a mother to provide childcare, to go out and work, to find success, to put food on the table, and to do all those things. Keep a roof over everybody's head, all right? And this was a very difficult thing for one person to shoulder. And a lot of times, women in this position might be in the bottom quintile or bottom 2 quintiles of the income distribution scale. And so Aid to Families with Dependent Children was considered this very, very merciful redistributive scheme. But some people said, well, there's a problem with that. And that is that women, because of the incentives built into the program, now this is going to sound crazy, okay? But the idea was that there's these incentives built into the program for two things: having more dependent children and not being married. And so there was this theory out there that welfare was a very entrapping system, that in other words, it rewarded you for having children out of wedlock and for not marrying. And indeed, there were people who would refuse to enter into a two-parent household situation because that would mean that they would lose their welfare check. This got uh, to be such an issue that in 1996, okay, got to go into a little history here, okay, in 1996, there was a certain president running for re-election. Okay, back up. In 1992, Bill Clinton won the presidency against George H.W. Bush, all right, in 1992. And the first 4 years of Bill Clinton's presidency were generally thought to be pretty liberal years for the time. Okay, this is before the dawn of AOC. This is before the dawn of even Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Okay, this is a 1992 liberalism. And so people thought of this as a pretty liberal presidency. And there was a lot of fear about Bill Clinton's reelection because usually presidents will go further, okay, in the direction that they want to have for their legacy because they don't have to face re-election. So there was this thought, oh, Bill Clinton is liberal and just wait till the next 4 years. And Bill Clinton was afraid that he was going to lose his re-election bid. And so he moved to the center a little bit, and he made what's called welfare reform. And he worked with a Republican-dominated Congress, and they passed the Welfare Reform Bill in 1996. And when they passed the Welfare Reform Bill, it had certain criteria that were changed to avoid these negative incentives that were seen to not only not solve the problem of poverty, but actually to entrap people in lifetimes of poverty. And so it became TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And the key word, temporary, okay? Now there were limits on how long a family could receive cash assistance. Okay. And so that means that it's temporary. And it also meant that you had to show in good faith that you were making progress toward working or toward job training to get TANF. All right. And so there was kind of an element to it that was, okay, we're going to make this very, very specifically temporary so that this does not become a perpetuating cycle where people grow up on welfare and then they get welfare and then their children get welfare and their children's children get welfare. And that's how they exist. Other forms of welfare might be housing assistance that can help you through either a subsidy, which means that the apartment you get or the house you get is much cheaper than it normally would be because the government pays for it, or the government gives you a check that you can write for housing. It would also be food stamps. Now, people don't really call them food stamps anymore, but at the federal level, we still refer to the food stamp rolls, government assistance. Today, food stamps, when I worked for Publix, when I got out of college, in the mid 90s, I got food stamps handed to me during my training, and they were little paper booklets that had various lightly colored stamps in them, different various colors. And when people wanted to pay for their groceries, they ripped food stamps out of these paper books that they would carry around in their wallet or purse. And that's how they would pay for their food. Now, of course, you see people with EBT cards, right? Electronic benefits transfer cards. Transfer payments, right? Transfers of what? Transfers of benefits to people electronically. And so it comes out of government coffers. It's an electronic benefit transfer card, EBT card. There are various programs that are underneath the food stamp program to help with hunger, to help with poverty, like SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, like WIC, where it gives money specifically to young mothers and their children for specific goods. If any of you have ever worked in a grocery store where someone brings in a WIC check, and I'm sure it's a WIC card now, where they're allowed to buy a certain size and a certain amount of what might be considered healthy or high-calorie foods that are appropriate for children, orange juice, milk, peanut butter, bread, and the WIC program helps mothers to purchase these things. All right. Those are all underneath the category of food stamps. You also have SSI, and SSI falls underneath the Social Security Administration, and it's supplemental security income, SSI. This is given to people who have a disability, or they maybe lose a parent at a very young age, and they get an SSI contribution that allows them to have some assistance if they are sick or poor. So it's not just being under the poverty line, but it's also having an additional reality in your life, such as single head of household, sick, disabled, in need of nutritional support, etc. Okay, and these are all ideas that people within the welfare system have had. Also, child care subsidies, the idea that you should have your child care paid for by the government because you need someplace for your kids to go that's safe during the day. And so when we think about these various forms of welfare, a person who says yes to these obviously believes that having a roof over someone's head and having supplemental nutrition to make sure that people eat enough to survive and enough to be healthy and can feed their children in this way. The school lunch programs that you keep reading about in the paper, where even though schools are closed, families are coming by and picking up 2 meals a day at these various public school distribution sites. Child care subsidies, temporary assistance to needy families, checks, SSI, all of these, a person who says yes to these would say this is creating a very important and very vital safety net. They would say a country cannot function without a safety net for these people who have fallen below the ability to make good wages. They're in a temporary situation, they're in a difficult situation, and these are all examples of calm, right, moral, just solutions to help these people who have less. And so they're going to justify those programs by saying simply that they provide what they provide: childcare, nutrition, job training, a roof over your head. And so, of course, people who support the idea of that government can improve outcomes through welfare would argue that these things are on their face very obvious. What about the people who say no to welfare? What really does that mean? Well, people who say no to welfare generally believe that welfare can create its own set of negative incentives. And so they point to the fact that welfare can give people a disincentive to work, a disincentive to make money to purchase their own food, a disincentive for budgeting, a disincentive for more responsible living. It can entrap people in a system of poverty, and it can pass down an idea that poverty will always be there. So they would say that it encourages, because things like temporary assistance to needy families encourages illegitimacy. It encourages people that they can have children at very young ages out of wedlock. It encourages teenage pregnancy. It encourages, because in a person who's against a welfare safety net is saying, well, what the safety net really is doing is it's encouraging certain behaviors. It's encouraging behaviors that we don't want to see. So if a person smokes, a carton of cigarettes a day, and that costs them $50, but they can afford to buy that because they use food stamps to pay for their nutrition, for their actual food, they would say, well, that's a problem. Okay, they would say that that's encouraging the kind of behavior that instead you want to discourage. And so a lot of people who argue against welfare would say that there has been a lot spent on welfare, on in-kind transfers and other direct payments in cash to people for a very long time, that Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, in the 1960s, he set out to spend a whole lot of money Okay. And he said, we're having a war on poverty and we're going to eliminate poverty as a nation with all this spending. And a person who's against welfare as a government intervention would say, well, where is the elimination of poverty? You saw the numbers where it's kind of stayed a little bit static around that 12 to 14%, right? 11 to 14% mark of families that continue to fall under what we call the poverty line. And so if you can fix it through a social safety net, then why isn't it fixed? Now, certainly people who support welfare would say because it's not wide enough, because it's not distributed well enough, because it is chintzy, because it is cheap. They argue, and you can see people, you can find people doing this, talking about how food stamps isn't enough, and they'll do these graphics where they show you, well, this is what it costs to eat on food stamps, and is that really enough for a family? Well, food stamps are supposed to be assistance for nutrition. They're not supposed to provide a whole family's food to eat every day. But nonetheless, they will try to argue that the problem isn't the program. The problem is the lack of funding or the type of training or the type of assistance given to families, and that there needs to be simply more of it or have it better administered, and then welfare will work, right? And then you might find some people in the middle on maybe who would believe in some forms of assistance, and usually forms that are temporary, kind of get people back on their feet assistance, whether you're talking about unemployment insurance or whether you're talking about food stamps for a short time. And so some people would kind of strike down the middle on that issue. But we will leave that up to your judgment, and I also hope research. We shouldn't be just like, I like this one. We should know something about what we're talking about, look at the facts and the realities of the welfare system in all its iterations, and make a good and philosophical and correct and moral decision on these issues. All right. And so we're going to talk about the next policy. All right. Another potential government intervention that some people believe would be helpful is what's called a negative income tax. And we're going to go through and give BanQ's examples on a negative income tax. Okay, a negative income tax is when a person is actually paid money because of what they make, rather than having to pay into the federal income tax system. And so Mankiw gives the example of the government using a formula to figure out what people owe in taxes, or what's called their tax liability. Okay, so he gives the suggestion. Let's look at the income. Let's say that a family makes $60,000. Okay, and so you would say, how would you figure out this person's tax liability? Well, this is an example. Okay, you take a third of their income, so $20,000, and then you subtract from that amount $10,000, and you say, okay, well, this person's tax liability would now be $10,000, right? A third of the income, $20,000 minus $10,000. So this person's tax liability would now be $10,000. What about a family making $90,000? If a family makes $90,000, we take a third of their income, which is $30,000, subtract $10,000, and now this family that makes $90,000 owes $20,000 to the coffers. If a family makes $30,000, 10,000 minus 10,000, zero. Oh, they don't owe any tax money. And then what about 15,000 though? That's where we come up with the negative income tax, because if you take a third of 15,000 and you come up with 5,000 and you subtract 10,000, this person is now owed, okay, their liability is negative 5,000. Makes sense? Their tax liability is negative 5,000. They owe negative. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the monies that were put into the coffer, and we're going to pay these people the negative, right? We're going to pay them $5,000. And this is called a negative income tax. And many people believe that this is a better way of getting it done than having a program like AFDC or something that will make people take certain behaviors in order to get the money. So in other words, having children out of wedlock, refusing to enter into two-parent homes, living in government subsidized housing, things that we don't want to encourage. This would instead just give them a straight income, okay? They say, oh, this is much more straightforward. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to go out and have a single household. You don't have to do those things. What you have to do instead is simply have an income that falls low enough in the formula to give you a negative income tax, and that then is your only qualification. So people who advocate a negative income tax say it's got all the benefits of helping the poor without the nastiness of developing negative incentives. But as you can imagine, people that say no to this government intervention say, well, the whole entire system is an intervention to earn a low income, right? The whole entire system is nothing but a way to transfer wealth. And what will tend to happen is that the people making $60,000 are going to look at this situation and say, boy, I really feel like I'm getting a raw end of the deal. The people who make $90,000 are thinking the same thing. And so they start to say, well, why should I work so hard to earn this high salary when I'm going to be penalized in this way? And so if you think about it, what's really interesting is here, the $60,000 person takes the biggest hit in this. If you use that flat formula, right, 30,000 minus 10,000, they owe a $20,000 tax debt, so they get to keep 70,000. The $60,000 person, right, keeps $50,000. So yes, but all things being equal, by only getting to keep 50,000 out of 60 versus 70 out of 90, they're taking a bigger overall hit. And so people who are against this would say that this is a very bad idea, okay, because it's going to create a laziness, okay, and a willingness for people not to work and not to earn and not to certainly move into those higher income quintiles. All right, now, there are some actual examples. We do not have a negative income tax in the United States, but we do have what is called the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC. Earned income tax credit. What this means is that if you are earning an income, now that's a key, you have to be having earned income. And this can be from a job, but it can also be from things that are considered passive incomes like rent, royalties, payments on insurance settlement, things like that. Earned income tax credit, okay? If you are earning income and it falls below a certain line, you can get the earned income tax credit. And what that does is it does allow you to receive income taxes that are greater than what you would ever pay in. Okay, so it kind of acts as a negative income tax, but it's restricted, okay, to people earning income. It's not just, okay, well, you made zero, so now you get money. Earned income, and you have to meet certain criteria for this to take place. There's also a child tax credit. What is the name of that? The child tax credit has hold on. Sorry, guys, it's just called the child tax credit. Okay, the child tax credit is for families with children 17 and below, and at certain points, they can get money back on their taxes or taken off of their tax liability for those children if they are dependents. Okay, so if they are not earning their own income or being claimed by another person as a dependent, you can get a tax credit for the children that you're raising and keep more of your money. You can earn both the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, but you have to qualify for both. The earned income tax credit and the child tax credit are both examples of negative income taxes. Okay, in other words, income tax that's paid to you rather than you paying it out. But they serve two different purposes, and they also have two very different criteria. So, of course, a person who believes in the in the negative income tax thinks that this is a better and more respectful way to give people assistance. In other words, you're not saying, here's money for food, here's money for housing, here's money for, you're just giving them cash payment. People who are against this say these people groups that are in these lower income brackets are sometimes amongst the lowest educated and those with poor habits. And so drugs, alcohol, unwise purchases, those are going to be things that are necessarily going to be part of the thing. And it's better to give those families assistance that they can buy food stamps with and nutrition with and housing with than it is for them to get cash, which might be used on things that people who want to manage these choices don't agree with. People who are against the negative income tax that are libertarians would say you shouldn't be redistributing income at all. And so this is off the table for them to begin with. A utilitarian would have to find that middle ground, right? Because they understand that there can be negative incentives. So they've got to figure out how do you walk that line and how do you do this most safely. So maybe you could argue that liberals, I think this is very broad brush, but just to throw out there to revisit our philosophies, liberals might believe in a negative income tax credit or guaranteed universal income. You've heard that batted around in some of the Democratic presidential primaries as an idea. A utilitarian might be more moderate and to say, no, we should have these assistance programs that function as a safety net. And then a libertarian says, no transfers of wealth. This shouldn't be happening. If you want this to happen, have it done through charity where people are giving their funds and fix the system so that more people can have more income mobility. Take more government out and you'll actually have people rise up the ladder faster. Okay? All right. We've got a couple more things to talk about. Okay, new possible government intervention that might help people to close the income gap or to lower poverty. What about this idea? Straight out of the 90s, it's called workfare. All right, remember how I talked about in the 90s, there was this welfare reform? Well, in the 90s, some governors, specifically one governor by the name of Scott Walker in Wisconsin, they started experimenting with programs called workfare. And what they basically said is if you want government assistance, if you want, the equivalent of AFDC, you want payments, you want help with childcare, you want housing subsidies, then you must work to get those things. And so they instituted programs where in order to get these things, you had to show that you were gainfully employed. And with that employment came this idea of workfare. Now, you might think, well, that seems fairly obvious. Well, hang on a second, okay? In the old system of welfare, the old system of aid to families with dependent children, it really was counterproductive in some ways because what they were finding is that they would set a rate. If you make below this, you can get this check. And what would happen is if a person went out and they got a very temporary or a very part-time, low-paying job, that job might just break through that poverty level. That minimum standard. And so what might happen is that as that income just barely crests above what's considered livable, just when a person is beginning to make an income, then the check is taken away. Okay. And the government welfare is taken away. And now this person's thinking to themselves, well, okay, before I could get this check straight out, now I'm going to work for 40 hours a week. Okay. I have to arrange for my children. I have to go to the job. I have to transport myself there. I have to worry about dinner when I get home. Why would I do that to just barely break even or make a little bit more? And so what they found is that these programs, they were actually had a negative incentive for working. And that was not the design. Okay, I don't think that's the design of a utilitarian, of a liberal, or of a libertarian, that we say, oh, good, no one's working. Okay, now we can get nefarious and talk about theories, but let's not go there. Let's give people a little bit of benefit of the doubt that they believe, or that a lot of people believe, that these programs are actually helping and beneficial, and the best intentions, but also the best reality and best outcomes for people. But what workfare did, and of course, workfare has become a term, that's a little outdated. But when we talk about programs with work incentives, anti-poverty programs, we talk about programs that ask families to, or individuals to make a show that they have pursued some kind of specific economic training, job training, education, or that they are indeed working and contributing in order to receive government assistance. And so often this workfare, these incentives, they are tied to ideas like the temporary nature of things, tied to education and training. If you show that you have earned certain certificates or degrees, that you can continue to get this assistance as long as you are in school or in the job training or working on a certain situation and trying to lift one's self out of poverty. So, okay, so what about workfare? Well, people who are for it, they would say that this is positive. They would say that this recognizes incentives. They would say that this is better than the alternative of just handouts. They would say that this is dignified for people and that it asks them to contribute something for the money that they're going to have given to them. And so people who believe in this would say, oh, all of these things are super good things, super wonderful things. But what about people who say, no, this is a horrible idea? Well, people who are against workfare would say perhaps that this is exploitative, that it is undignifying, that you're making people go to work in dead-end jobs. In Wisconsin, people, in order to get their checks, they had to work, and so they might end up sweeping streets. They might end up working for municipalities and collecting garbage or being meter maids. And people say, oh, that's very exploitative, that's very undignifying. These people are already the lowest income earners in society, and to get their welfare check, right, to get their assistance, they have these young children, and now you're going to make them work, unskilled jobs to go and get them. Why can't we as a society be more giving? And why would we cause them to come out of their homes and to have to work when they should be being home with their children and giving support? Some have very terrible family situations. Some people have very terrible health situations, mental health situations, and so workfare is a negative, and it's not merciful, and it is not a viable solution. And so workfare programs have been alternately lauded and criticized over time. Mankiw ends his section on workfare here. He asks, how has reform worked? He's talking about welfare reform in general, right? The debate over the bill persists to this day, but there's no doubt that its passage was followed by a large decrease in the welfare rolls and a large increase in employment among those groups traditionally on welfare. Okay. So in general, welfare reform was passed in a bipartisan sense, and it did take a lot of people off of what we might call the welfare rolls. Sometimes those numbers have climbed again. For a little while, the food stamp numbers were just through the roof. Before this whole coronavirus thing happened, food stamps had actually been in decline for many, many, many months. Far less people on food assistance and applying for food assistance than there had been in a long time in America. Of course, right now, we have tons of people on assistance, unemployment checks, food bank lines, local charity lines, applying for food stamps. We have a situation in our economy that is not only unheard of, but I think unthought of. The idea that the economy would be shut to this degree is a very difficult thing to deal with. What you believe about how you can best turn this around and get out of this, not talking about the virus, but the economic impact. It has a lot to do with your philosophy about economics, about property rights, about incentive, about mankind. What you believe about man's nature has a lot to do with how you think we should economically incentivize people in this recovery phase. And I do hope and pray, guys, that we are entering a recovery phase from this, and that before too long, things will be back open, and that we can be together again, and that we'll get to celebrate graduation together, celebrate baccalaureate together. And I really, really pray that we also get to do our Thomas Sowell dinner together. And I hope that we might be announcing that time and location soon. So I'm going to sign off. This has been a good discussion of some of the policy and the yes no babies that we must handle. And now that you're done watching this video, you should begin to review in earnest for the big test coming up. All right. Good night.